we want to have a bit of a moment to have a masterclass. And my friend Will is going to jump on the screen here in a moment. Really, really excited to have Will joining us. He's going to be answering some questions, going to have some conversation about HubSpot. So we want this to be a bit of an educational time as far as a rally as well. So this little section is going to be a masterclass from Will. So we're going to bring Will up on the screen. I'm going to go off the screen and we're going to let Will take over. Will, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. And yes, I am coming in as the previous writer of the last section as well. And I recognize there may have been a couple of questions in that last trivia section that all of the answers were correct. So technically, yes. But I apologize to anyone that isn't as pedantic as I am. So I'm going to share my screen. And like I said, I'm going to be talking through a masterclass on migrations, particularly migrating to HubSpot. So I'm going to share my screen. Great. I am hoping you can see my screen. Please, someone let me know if you can't. So this masterclass is going to talk about migrations, particularly from Salesforce to HubSpot. Now, I know some of you may not be on Salesforce. If you're here, you might be a big HubSpot advocate and fan, in which case you might already be on HubSpot, or you might not necessarily be on Salesforce, but you might be coming from one of the other CRM systems. That's totally fine. This is intended to talk about Salesforce specifically, and we're using Salesforce as an example here because it is a very common use case. However, the principles I'm going to talk you through today will apply to pretty much any migration that you do. There will obviously be different levels of technical capability required for every single integration, but broadly, the topics we're going to be discussing today will apply to every single migration that you may or may not do. Now, I historically have been a HubSpot fan. I took a step away from HubSpot for a little while, and I actually worked for a Salesforce agency. Boo. I really did feel like I was taking a step into the dark side when I was there, and the pain that I felt while I was at that other agency was palpable. So I, these days, am fully HubSpot. I came back to a HubSpot agency. I'm back in HubSpot, and I absolutely love it here. And I am a ride or die HubSpot fan. I am director of growth. I have managed and done various different roles over the years. I have been both a boots on the ground salesperson, marketer, all the way up to a technical RevOps strategist. So I really do know what it feels like to be working within a CRM that you maybe aren't necessarily in love with. And I know what it feels like to be working in a CRM that you do love. So I will also be joined by Dante, who is in the background here. I don't know if you want to say hello and come on camera for a second, Dante. But there's Dante. Dante is going to be covering some of the more technical aspects, but he's going to be doing that in the chat. So if you have any specific technical questions you want covering, there will be a Q&A section at the end, but also you can drop it in and Dante will answer those questions for you. So today, what are we going to talk about? So first of all, we're going to talk about what a CRM is. It might seem pretty rudimentary, but ultimately, I want to set the groundwork here and think about how we are looking at our CRM. We'll then go into why you might be doing a migration, the various different use cases for why you might migrate, and then we'll jump into the how of how you actually do it. So what is a CRM? I'm quite intrigued. I'm going to be giving a definition in a second, but I'm quite intrigued to see in the chat how people would define a CRM as a whole. So I'm going to give you just 20 seconds, 30 seconds to drop in any definitions of a CRM that you might think is applicable. Yes, Shadab, that is true in most cases, not in HubSpot, but that is true. CRM is a software that salespeople hate to use. That's very true. It's definitely a software that I've hated to use in the past, that's for sure. Any other definitions before I jump into how we look at it? Operating system for the business, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, customer customer and prospect database. All of these are correct. None of these are incorrect. They are all true and accurate representations in the same way that 100 plus in my previous questions would have been correct answers technically. The way that we look at it is it is a platform that's used by various departments. It's not just sales. That's a key thing to say. It is across the entire organization. And it's about storing data and performing activities on it. And then crucially with something like HubSpot, using that data and using those activities to trigger actions automatically. That in turn takes some of the lift off your team. But ultimately the CRM portion of it is the data and the activity storage. It provides you with a single source of truth that gives you a clear picture of what you need. It gives you a clear picture of what you're doing, how your team is doing, where improvements are required, and all those sorts of things. But you need the data first, right? You can't start with the process. You can't jump into these automations without having that data there. And it often fails. A CRM project often fails due to a lack of adoption or structuring or misalignment between various different teams. And so you should start thinking of your CRM, if you're not already, as a product, not a project. If you think about it as a project, as a one and done, as a my CRM is now complete, then you will fail, or you're very likely to fail at least. Why is that? It's because once someone doesn't adopt it, the data then goes bad. You are not creating those updates to your CRM based on the actual usability of that CRM, but you're creating it on assumptions and all those sorts of things. So you really need to think about your CRM as a product that iteratively gets updated. And you, if you manage your CRM, need to think of yourselves as product owners. Every solution that you build to a problem that you have within your data or within your processes should be a feature for that larger product. And it's all about being agile. And the key here is that UX adoption, making sure people actually use it, is key, because if your processes are not adopted, they do not exist. So this is a kind of side-by-side comparison of treating it like a project to treating it like a product. The unknown unknowns become a blocker to use in a project. You can plan for everything, but there will always be things you don't plan for. Whereas in a product, you can uncover those naturally and address them as you go. The time to use in a project is dependent on a very lengthy scope of work. Usually, it's usually a very long time when you're still probably paying for a different CRM. Whereas the time to use is dependent on essentially reaching like a minimum viable product when you think about things from a product perspective. It's about reaching those things that you really need and then building on top of that. A lack of ownership in project side of things, quite often it's an external party that's brought in to implement a CRM. They then leave, no one owns that, and it gets very, very messy. Whereas if you think about it, that a product owner exists, that then results in process and data governance. And lastly, in a project, there's no base for feedback loops. The people who are actually using this, the people who are the boots on the ground, actively using this day to day, has no say in the setup of that CRM platform. And when that happens, they quite often won't adopt it. They won't use it because they don't find it easy to use. They don't find it user friendly. So iterative updates increase adoption. So let's talk about migrations and syncs, right? There is a key distinction to make here. Sometimes syncs are also referred to as integrations, but ultimately, a migration, which is what we're talking about today, is a movement of data from one platform to another platform that is a one-time move in order to usually sunset the previous data source. So that might be Salesforce, it might be a spreadsheet, it might be Zoho, but it could be anything. It could also not technically be a CRM system, but bring that data from somewhere else into a CRM system so you have visibility onto it. A sync, on the other hand, is a live update. So that can be monodirectional or bidirectional. So you can push from HubSpot into another platform, or both, push it into a HubSpot platform and bring the information back into HubSpot as well from the other platform. And that's really used when you don't want to sunset the other platform. It might be a piece of accounting software, for example, or it might be a fulfillment software that you have, something that HubSpot's not designed to do. And therefore, if you want those statuses or an update from those other platforms, then a sync is the better way to go. However, today we're talking about migrations, but it's very important to understand the difference and make sure you're going for the right thing and you're planning for the right thing. So why might you migrate? So there are various different known reasons. There's also lots of unknown reasons that you might migrate, but usually the ones that we see are your source system. The thing you're migrating from is too complex. This is super common with Salesforce users and Microsoft Dynamics users, that the system is so complex and it's so hard to maintain, it's so hard for people to use that they actually want to migrate off it. Another is there might be a change in process, team, company, objective, etc. It's important to remember that, is there a better solution? Don't let complacency, and we've always used this system, get in the way of what might genuinely be a better solution for your business. There might be a new go-to-market motion that you're launching. You might have started selling direct after being a PLG-led motion, for example, that then means you have a sales team and you need to start using a CRM more effectively. That might be another reason. Or it might literally just be the need to centralize that data and integrate various different tech stack pieces together. So that's kind of where we're coming from here. So how do you do it? This is the crux of it. So the main thing is to plan. This is what we're going to be talking about a lot today. The planning is the key element here. A lot of people think of migrations as a very technical piece of work, but like that is the case in some instances. There are things that you can keep your eye out for migrations that might mean it's technically complex. The great thing with Salesforce is that the integration between Salesforce and HubSpot is really strong. So the great thing about migrating from Salesforce is that the technical complexity is actually fairly easy. What you should be really careful about, though, is not looking at the migration as easy. So first of all, we have the team. You need to review and identify who you're mobilizing and how you're mobilizing those people, marketing, sales. If you have a previous Salesforce admin and a HubSpot admin, you need to identify who that's going to be. So that's the first thing you need to do. You also then need to look at the tech stack. So you have your source platform, in this instance, Salesforce. You will then have your end platform, in this HubSpot, and then any migration tools. Now that might be Excel. It might just be that you know that you need to have Excel. It might be that you want to use a third party like Zapier. You have to identify what are those other tools that you need to use. And as I'm saying this, I realize I have no idea whether or not you pronounce that word Zapier or Zapier. So if anybody actually knows the answer to that question, please drop it in the chat, because I honestly have no idea. I've used Zapier forever, and I suddenly realize I may not. Yeah, it's like Zapier. Great, awesome. Amazing. And then from a time frame perspective, don't expect this to be an overnight thing. Right? If you are sunsetting Salesforce, for example, at the end of August, you should be starting this process at the start of July, right? You should not think of this as an overnight thing where you just shift and dump, because that will cause problems and you won't get adoption. Your new CRM will be just as much of a failure as your old CRM, no matter which one you use, even if you are using HubSpot. It's all about adoption, treating it like a product, getting to that MVP. So you should expect, roughly, depending on the complexity of what you're migrating, 1 to 3 weeks of planning and cleaning, the most important part, then 1 to 2 weeks of pushing a sample set through, and then 1 to 2 weeks of a full migration. Again, entirely depends on the number of contacts you've got, number of objects, all those sorts of things, but that's a rough guideline. And in terms of the steps, so step number 1, phase 1 is planning. You need to know what you're doing. Stage 2 is cleaning. You need to make sure that your house is in order. You don't want to move in a messy home. You want everything to be clean. You want everything to be identified. You want to make sure that you don't have duplicate records. You want to make sure that the objects are clean. And you want to make sure that you are planning things correctly. You then want to prepare the new platform. So you want to prepare, in this case, HubSpot for that data to come in. You will have custom properties, most likely. You'll have custom needs. You want to prepare HubSpot for receiving that information. You then, crucially, you want to do a test. We would never recommend that you just push the whole thing straight away. You are not perfect. You will not know that you will make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes in every single instance. There's no way that you can prepare completely perfectly every single time. So push a batch of test data and then start to migrate the full set. So planning. In the planning stage, there are three main elements, three checklists you need to cover off. First is you need to identify the objects that are being migrated. Now, in the world of CRMs, objects mean things like companies versus contacts versus deals versus tickets, those sorts of things. You then need to identify the objects that aren't needed anymore. It doesn't mean that you delete the data, but when you're setting those things up, it's all about that MVP state. It's all about identifying what are the things we really need in this platform at this point. And lastly, you want to identify the object properties that are of the utmost importance and eliminate any other properties that you don't want. This will both speed up the process as well as make your new system cleaner. Now, there might be things that you want to have in the future, in which case it's definitely important to maintain that data somewhere. But in terms of that initial push and that initial migration, we would hugely recommend only bringing across the object properties that are of the utmost importance to you. It might be lead status or lifecycle stage, etc., those sorts of things. So an example here is an object mapping between two platforms, a platform and HubSpot. It's really important to identify exactly where those items are going to end up. And here's a screenshot of what an example object looks like in Salesforce. So we move on to the cleaning stage. So here are your checklist items for this. So number one, you want to dedupe any data in those objects. You want to make sure that there aren't duplicate records, duplicate contacts, deals, etc. It is much easier to do this in the source than it is to do it into the migrated. Lots of people ask, can't we just move everything over and then clean it up afterwards? It's going to make the whole process so much more difficult. It is much easier to dedupe within the source. You then want to remove any unwanted properties within those objects. Was there anything where you I just don't care if I know that or not? Again, it is easier in terms of being able to see all the properties that are available to you in that migration and all those sorts of things. And it is much easier if you delete that within the source, and then you're not dealing with incredible amounts of mess. And lastly, you want to create a tally of the total number of records per each object, just to make sure you know how much data is being moved across. You can cross-reference it, but you can also understand things like processing time. We have had ones that we've had migrations, and I've worked on migrations that have had upwards of 500,000 contacts. That takes some time to process, and therefore you need to make sure you know what you're getting into. So here's an example of account. So on the left, we see Salesforce, and we have a number of leads, number of contacts, etc. And here are a couple of examples of the kind of objects that you would need to start cleaning up, things like open cases and accounts within Salesforce. You then move on to the preparation stage. So we leave your source, we leave Salesforce, we leave wherever, and we move into HubSpot. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that everything aligns, essentially. So when you don't want it to be speaking a different language when you start to migrate that stuff across. So you want to create the properties in the destination platform, i.e. Salesforce, i.e. HubSpot. The property type should be the same. So if one is an SLT and one is a dropdown, you either need to make sure they match perfectly, or you need to make sure that they're the same type. The options should be added. So if it's a drop-down, for example, you need to make sure all those objects exist and are exactly the same. And you want to create a document showing the mapping of the source and the destination platform. So every single property should have a beginning state and an end state. This is the property within our source, within Salesforce. This is the property that is being mapped to within HubSpot. So this is an example of what it looks like within HubSpot. So this is the create a new property pane for anyone that hasn't seen this. This is how you would create a property. You need to make sure that those items are all there. And you want to just make sure that every single one of those properties exists within your new platform. We then enter into the testing phase. Now, this is a repeating circle. Do this as many times as is required. Don't do it once, find a bunch of errors, fix those errors or think you've fixed those errors, and then immediately go in for a migration. If it is not working perfectly, do not move on from the testing stage. You want to make sure that it is working perfectly before you move on to migration. So what you want to do is you want to sample migration, something like 100, 200 contacts. Again, it kind of depends on the size of your database and how much you're willing to clean up afterwards. The more you run, the more likely you are to hit errors, but also the more cleanup you'll have to do. So you'll need to make that call for yourself. And then you want to do a data check. You want to check that data that's come in, make sure everything is correct, and you want to make sure that the associations are correct as well. So not only the data on the contact object, for example, but is that contact associated to the right company, right? That is one of those things that people often overlook within this. They think as long as the data is right on that single record, as long as what I'm seeing on that piece of paper is correct, I'm not looking at the piece of paper it references, right? And you want to make sure that those references that it is showing to each other are correct as well. You want to make that is a crucial step that a lot of people overlook. You then want to check for any errors, any flags that are coming up, any problems within that data. You want to rectify those errors. And I'm really sorry, I've gone all blurry for some reason. I apologize. And then once you've rectified those errors, you run another sample migration. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Do not move on to the migration stage unless every single thing is working perfectly. If you can go through the data check, the associations check, check the errors, and there are none. If you skip the rectify error stage because there are none, that is the only time you move on to the migration stage. Examples of the kind of things that you might get within those errors. So it might be that there are different names. A really common one is the industry property when we're talking about Salesforce to HubSpot. Within Salesforce, that is a, I think I'm getting this right. It's a single line text, right? So people can input that. Now, if you don't enter that as one of the drop-down options, which is the standard industry field within HubSpot, then it will throw back an error. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. If you've misspelt something, if you haven't correctly lined them up, or if you've accidentally mapped it to the wrong property, they are the kind of errors we are looking for here, and they're the ones you need to really identify within this stage. If you do that with a couple of hundred contacts, that's okay. If you do it with 50,000, that's when it gets really difficult to rectify. And then finally, you can move on to the migration stage. This is the fun bit, right? This is when you push all of it. It's fun. It always gives me a little bit of an adrenaline rush to make sure I have caught every single one of the errors. But this is when you actually go through that stage of migrating all that data, and then you can move everything across. Now, one thing I really want to make transparent here is that in the vein of thinking of your CRM as a product, not a project, it's important to remember that this may not be the only migration you ever do. It might be that at this point, all you care about is sales activity in HubSpot, and therefore you might be migrating from Salesforce. But at a later point, actually, you know what? I want to think about marketing, and you've previously been using MailChimp, and you do another migration. So it's important to remember that this isn't necessarily a one and done. And it's important to remember that you have the ability to migrate in phases, and actually it's recommended. The other thing that is really important to remember here is this is not the end state. This is the start. Once you have your data in HubSpot, it is then the task to make sure that everybody adopts it, that you're using it correctly, to set up the tools correctly. All those sorts of things come afterwards. Do not think of once the data is in there, suddenly I have perfect visibility, suddenly everything is working perfectly. It is once the data is in that you really start the process. This is just kicking off, and it's really important to remember that. Okay, so we're now going to jump into Q&A. I think we've got about 10 minutes for it. If I can get an update if that's the wrong number. If you want to get in touch with me, there is a QR code in the bottom right here that goes through to my LinkedIn. If you have any questions that you don't want to ask in this forum here, then you can drop me it on LinkedIn, and we can discuss it in a non-public forum if there's something specific you want to talk about. But please do drop any questions into the chat, and I will answer them as we come. And I may call on Dante if they're slightly more technical, because I'm more on the management side than the nitty gritty side of things. Okay, so I'm going to intro Dante now, and see whether or not Dante has seen any questions that I haven't yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in the chat answering what I can. We had a couple questions on if we could migrate images and videos, which we can. Imports can do files, which includes images and videos. The other question we had was when to use custom objects when migrating. And that really comes down to more of your use case. There's a lot of reasons where you can kind of hijack the standard objects like contacts, company, or if you have something like a contract where you have a running record where it's changing year per year and you would like a track record of that history, that would be a good time to use a custom object. The next question I see is, how do you recommend dealing with a contact object and a customer object in Salesforce? In HubSpot, there's contact and their life cycle stage will be customer. You can either have it come in as a contact. I have seen where customers are pulled in as contacts. There are instances where you can have those as companies. So you would have that customer account come in as a company and then have the associated contacts. So that would be a good way to do that. Next question. Migration is different than connecting your CRM to HubSpot with a native integration, right? I guess it really gets into the nitty-gritty of migration versus ongoing integration. You can have a migration that is an ongoing integration.
We recommend in that instance that there's no point in doing a migration that doesn't use that native integration, right? Yeah. Like you just run it once, basically, rather than running it multiple times. Right. That's the great thing about it, is that it is native and it is designed for this. So in short answer, you would use the native integration. You would just run it once, test everything, and then remove the integration afterwards once you sunset Salesforce.
I do see some mentions in the chat about some migration tools like Import2, TrueJ. A lot of these are quite handy if you're doing a migration. I think if you're thinking migration versus integration, a migration, I would say, would be a one-off. So you're leaving that system and going into HubSpot rather than an ongoing integration. Yeah.
We do have one other question from Shadab as well that I'm actually going to pass across to Dante because I think he's much better suited than I am. What do you recommend when importing properties data versus activities data?
Properties data, Shadab, do you mean like specific field properties versus?
I think that's what he means. Yeah, I think it's the data that's held on a contact record versus like activity data in terms of calls and those sorts of things.
Okay, properties versus engagements. Engagements are, that's a bit of a tricky one. Properties are rather straightforward. There's a lot of properties you can use that are HubSpot native, or custom properties are great. There's engagements are pretty fun. There's the standards. I don't know, Shadab. I'm pretty engagements are pretty straightforward. Like you can migrate engagements, activities, calls, meetings. You just have to specify which ones you would like. But HubSpot, it is very simple to migrate all of those and associate it to this particular contact.
Yeah, what I'd add to that as well is that I think associations are the key thing there. And yes. on that slide I showed with the circular motion, that's why it's so important to look at associations, particularly when you're looking at engagement data. Now, some people won't care about the engagement data. And just for anyone that is listening that doesn't know what I'm talking about here, we're talking about things like call records, note all those sorts of things that appear as an activity on a contact object or a deal object or a company object. The key thing there is that exists as almost like its own mini object, and so you have to make sure that those associations exist. Because if they don't exist, then they'll just end up floating with no association, right? And then they're useless. So I think that's the key thing there is the process is largely similar. The process of mapping, we want these objects to end up here, these micro objects, these email comms, etc., to end up in this place within HubSpot. Totally doable. The key thing there is to, when you're double checking and when you're testing, that's where the difference comes in, because it's less about checking that the information has ended up there and more about checking that that association exists. It's very easy to overlook associations that don't exist, right? You look at a contact object and you see, oh, well, that property right there doesn't have the information filled out. That's really easy to see. But when that is out of your line of sight, when that object sits separate with no association somewhere else, that's when it gets really tricky. So it's particularly within that testing, sample, errors side of things, that is the key pain when it comes to the engagement metrics as opposed to the process metrics. The information, the properties. Does that answer your question? Yeah, great. I've seen Shadab's response. Do we have any other questions that we haven't answered? Either previously answered ones, just having a quick check, and if not, I'll pass it back over. How do you recommend dealing with having a contact object and a customer object? Have we covered that, Dante?
Yeah, I did mention that one. Yep.
Great, awesome. Great, I think that's everything. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. If you do have any other questions, I'm going to give another few seconds. QR code in the bottom right of this page. Please scan it, and I will also share the LinkedIn. Yep, thank you, Karen. I will also share the LinkedIn profile in here. You can also reach out to us afterwards in any other way, shape, or form. So please do reach out if you do have any other questions that you want answering, or if you want to dig into the questions that we have answered in more detail. So I'm going to pass back over to Billy now, and thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it.